So what we want to talk about is a few more advanced glazing techniques. We talked about putting glaze into an area that you carved in, then rubbing it out and cleaning the sponge and rubbing it out on the outside so that it looks really sharp. What we're doing here is we're using tape. Really simple. We're going to tape out an area and we're going to glaze it. So it is, of course, helpful if your glazes are in good shape. That means they're kind of what we call paintable. So I'm going to use this glaze, this one just about like heavy creamish. We're going to do a few coats. Now, one thing about glaze is once you get that first coat on there, this coat will help the next coat dry. So as it dries, the next layer of glaze will stick to it better. So we've got this layer. We'll let that dry a little bit. Now, the other thing is, we talked about if you have a Snickers bar, if you have regular food items, if you have cereal, you may want to rename it something more interesting. Sort of like the other video where we couldn't really tell what the name was on there, but it didn't say Snickers. It was a little different. So I have some stuff I printed out. You might also want to print out letters or fonts that have some mass to them. So if you want something really thin and script, you can do that too. But for demonstration purposes, we're using thicker letters. So what I've done is I start with this, and then I trace it so that I can see through it and move it around to different areas. I actually don't have another letter, so I'm going to trace it again. So I'm going to put the T on here. I can line this up again. So this is just regular tracing paper. I usually call this physical Photoshop. I'm using just basic physical techniques. You can measure an area and then in the Word program, snap the grids on, the ruler. You can print it to make sure it works. So I'm going to use a transfer paper. This transfer paper has an ink on it. We want the ink face down or you'll be transferring onto your other paper. You also may want to use a damp sponge and just wipe off the back of the transfer paper because when it gets dusty, it doesn't like to imprint very well. So I line this up. I'm just going to line up with my other letters and I tape it down so it doesn't move because I can see through the paper. Then I lift it up and I put this underneath it. So I'm going to draw through, basically on top of this tracing paper, up to my glaze line. I might have even made a mark where this glaze line is because that's where I want it. And then my image comes out. Yeah. So this ink will also help separate the glaze from another glaze. Whoops. Okay, what color do I want here? I use the green. I'm going to contrast. Yeah, I'll stick with the green. So I also might want to use a brush. This brush has a flat edge, a little 90-degree angle. So we're going to paint this in, glaze it in right up to that edge. And I'm going to have this touch this glaze. But what we talked about in the other video is depending on how thick and how much glaze you're using, you might not want it to touch other glazes. You don't know if it will completely mix together. We talked about how the kiln fires and that it might mix in with another glaze if the kiln gets hotter than usual because it's really full. So we're going to go right up to that glaze to kind of continue our word through this, our kind of design cycle there, little design. So I'm going to add a third coat of this green. Bless you. You're sneezing in my video. So there's my 3 coats. I'm going to peel this glaze, this tape off, and I get a really sharp line. Typically students really love that sharp line. You can also make shapes out of this tape by cutting it, like squares, diamonds, checkers, things like that. We're going to let this dry and then add another stripe to it. So I'm going to put a piece of tape. Now also, to get this really smooth, you're going to want to rub the tape a little bit. Whatever edge is touching the glaze, you're going to want to rub that into your piece a little bit. So while this is drying, we're going to talk about another technique. This is a wax resist. It used to be butter, fake butter. Now it's a wax resist. So this is a beeswax. So it's mushy. It's after Halloween, but this is great for fake boogers. So this looks like, if you've seen beeswax, that's what it looks like. This is kind of like beeswax blended up with water somehow. I don't really know how. And it's liquid. This will gradually dry out. That's why there's dry wax in there too. So we can use this to wax our letters. So I kind of want to use this brush because it's nice and sharp there. So I'm going to clean this brush out. And then I can cover, so this was glazed. I can wax over this just to the edge. A little bit over that line so that it creates a small amount of space between this glaze and the next glaze. You might like this technique, you might not. So I use this technique a lot on this kind of stuff where I glaze a piece, little area, I wax it, I put another glaze around it, I wax that, and I keep going. Same thing here. Can we see that in the video? So this was waxed. Actually, the bottom wasn't because there's no other glaze. This was waxed. Also, this is a great example of this chrome glaze was kind of thick, so it dripped down a bit. So that's kind of what we're talking about. These lines were created just like we're taping, where I made a space, then I waxed, and it leaves a small space between the glazes. It's up to you whether you have that space or not. Okay, this is just about dry. So I'm going to tape right along this line. Oh, it's not really sticking well. Let's let that dry a little more. Dry. Okay, now the advantage of this, we'll use a darker glaze so we can really see it. So first of all, I'm going to take a soft brush. This wax was done yesterday. This wax has water in it, so it does take time to dry. One period's really not enough time. 8 hours is plenty of time. This was yesterday. So I can glaze right up to this, and you notice the glaze pulling away, sort of like a waxed car. You're covering that paint so that the water would bead up on the paint. Now, just like a waxed car, let's say it rains. That water doesn't really stick to the paint or the wax, but if you don't get the water off, it kind of dries there and you get those spots anyway. The reason I'm saying that is because if I went over this, this will pull away. See how it pulls away?
Wow.
Magic. So it pulls away really nice and clean. But those dots of glaze will stay there and fire there. So you want to use a sponge. I have some detail sponges or these yellow sponges, and you want to kind of mop this up just a little bit. And, you know, depending on how OCD you are about this, if I don't get rid of that, it's really just going to be on there and kind of look messy. So this is not a technique you have to use, but it's a fun technique. So I have a little space between my glazes, and it cleans up really nicely. If you want to avoid having to sponge it off, you can really just kind of go up to it, and it will pull away from it really nicely. Okay, let's see if this sticks now. What's our time on there?
9:30.
Oh, gotta stop. It's too much. Okay, last one. I'm taping over what I glazed already. I'm going to do this spot, and this will be our last one. So this will connect to the other glaze. We're going to let that dry a little bit. It'll suck it up. Your bisque-fired clay, we talked about chemical change with your clay. It is not going back to how it was. Okay, We've got a couple coats on there. You may want to let this dry. If you pull this off and it's too wet, you might not get a clean line. Oh, that's pro. And then as you pull it off, you don't really want this wet tape to touch the rest either. Okay, so there's our test and some different techniques you can try. We hit stop on there.